Hi, my name is Sarah Jaquette Ray, and I'm an Associate Professor of Environmental Studies and the Program Leader of Environmental Studies at Humboldt State University. I'm also the CSU member of the planning team for the CAN. This presentation is divided into two parts. One is a summary of the various goals I have had after attending 4 CAN workshops for improving the teaching of climate change and environmental justice in my own work, which includes leading a nascent environmental studies BA program at Humboldt State, research and service in the field of environmental justice and environmental humanities, and of course, teaching. From discussions with all of the CAN colleagues, I gained an enormous amount of knowledge about best practices. I learned solutions to commonly shared problems, cultivated the muscle of radical imagination, and built relationships in my own network. The experience emboldened me to more urgently implement best practices that I had suspected were valuable, such as integrating service learning, community-based education, and professionalization into environmental studies curricula, changing institutional incentives around what counts as research in my role as program leader, building courses that serve students' lives as social change agents, and investing in relationships with my colleagues in other disciplines, units, and institutions. But the major lesson that emerged for me from the CAN workshops was the need to support student activists, to integrate the goal of supporting their affective resiliency in my research, professional life, teaching, and program leadership. I've long believed that experts in my field, environmental studies, have told me that it's the problem-solving field par excellence. We are defined by our unique training and expertise at solving problems. But the CAN has shifted my perspective on this. I am now convinced that affective resilience, the emotional ability to deal with climate change and to sustain the work needed to address it, is as important for all of us and for our students as their ability to problem solve. In fact, I just listened to a podcast called Terrestrial on eco-anxiety, which cited research by psychology professionals that concludes nobody can solve any problems unless they're affectively equipped to do so. In other words, they're not in fight or flight mode. Therefore, nearly everything I describe in the first part of my talk about best practices and goals stems from this guiding value. In the conference following our viewing of this talk, I'd love to help brainstorm how you might do some of these things too, and get advice about how you've been successful at achieving some of these goals. Another valuable lesson for me was what I gained by immersing myself in a book that shaped our workshop process, Emergent Strategy by Adrienne Maree Brown. Some of you may remember Abby Reyes discussing the book in her workshop facilitation setup comments. This book has helped me acknowledge the value of all of these other efforts rather than feel burnt out or paralyzed in the face of the scale of the world's problems and institutional barriers to our goals. Therefore, the latter part of my talk considers emergent strategy in the context of the CAN. I really look forward to your thoughts, suggestions, and, dare I suggest, potential offers of collaboration on all of these topics. So for part 1, best practices, I want to summarize some key ways I will continue to work towards the goals of the CAN in teaching climate justice in culturally responsive ways. First, this semester I propose a 100-level introductory course designed to be a problem-driven, interdisciplinary, potentially co-taught course for my majors in environmental studies or any students interested in the major. My hope is that it will structuralize an interdisciplinary course where a problem like climate change or sustainability can be approached over the duration of a semester. Second, the CAN experience has inspired me to take on a few larger projects over the next few years, all of which directly or indirectly support the broader value I described above of promoting affective resiliency among the next generation of climate justice leaders. One of those things is to collaborate with colleagues in religious studies, international studies, and climate science to develop an institute on our campus to generate more knowledge and research internationally at the intersection of climate and environment and spirituality. Another is to develop my own next book project on the questions that seem to be at the core of so many of our workshop discussions: how to keep students engaged, feeling efficacious, and empowered in the movement for climate justice. The topic of the book will be the role of affect or emotion in climate justice and environmental studies, with a particular focus on pedagogy and teaching. I plan to make progress on this book project during a 2018-19 sabbatical, and may be getting in touch with many of you for interviews, resources, and collaborations. What are the best practices you're using in classes or elsewhere to integrate affective resiliency in your students? What role, if any, do emotional responses to climate change and climate injustice play in your work? A third goal that I have is to increase my efforts to integrate the environmental studies curriculum with the community through the good relationship I'm building with our Center for Community-Based Learning. I piloted a service learning senior capstone this semester, but the CAN prompted me to continue to work to structuralize service learning into the curriculum and build relationships with community partners. The long-term goal here might be to support my collaborator in the Center for Community-Based Learning to apply for a UACRE grant to emulate what we learned about in the Fullerton workshop. The CAN inspired me also to collaborate with a student who's been TAing a one-unit course for me called An Activist's and Organizer's Self-Care Toolkit, and a few other faculty who have expressed interest in the Critical Race, Gender, and Sexuality program here to develop a GE course on my campus called something like Self-Care for the 21st Century Social Change Agent. Building resilience into our students' toolkits is at least as important as the content they learn in our classes. And our counseling and psychological services aren't getting any more resources despite the increasing incidence and forms of trauma our students face. In the longer term, my final goal would be that the biggest dream to have here is to use the facilitation processes that we've observed in our workshops to train student climate leaders at my campus. I envision something like a boot camp in the summer that draws on the approaches to action and leadership as espoused by Adrienne Maree Brown, and that emphasize the organizing and cultural production and mediation required by the social justice-focused environmental movement. Ideally, this boot camp would be especially targeted to students in underrepresented communities and funded by some amazing grant that I have yet to find or apply for. For starters, I'd like to get my feet wet by practicing this facilitation process in my classes as a kind of pedagogy. I'm assigning Brown's book in my class next semester to get this started, and I'll be seeking advice from many of you over the next few years if this seed takes hold, since these areas of grant writing and leadership training are holes in my own toolkit. But I was so inspired by the processes I witnessed and experienced during the workshops. And furthermore, such trainings for students would arguably be the next step following the logic of the book project I described above. In this part 2 of my talk, I'd like to call it a love letter to the CAN. The reason I call it this is because of the centrality of emotion to our work and the work that we've been discussing, and the centrality of love to sustaining it. I don't mean this in a sappy way. I mean to say that our guilt, grief, disgust, sadness, and anxiety about all the problems of the world stem from our love of the planet and its inhabitants. And I want to share with you how I believe the CAN is an expression of this foundational belief. I also believe that reframing our anxiety as the other side of the coin of love, a point that social activists and scholars from Martin Luther King and bell hooks to Josh Fox's new film and contemporary eco-psychology all beautifully argue elsewhere, is essential to sustaining the work of the network. That's why I was so drawn to this book, Emergent Strategy, which so much that I organized a book group around it in the weeks following the CAN. The first concept from Emergent Strategy I'll discuss is the value of community, relationships, and conversation. Stuff that, I'm sorry to confess, I've always dismissed as a waste of my time. Distractions from the work of checking things off my list, not yielding material, tangible deliverables, and therefore not a priority. In fact, the work of building relationships and having conversations with the right people always seemed a nuisance to me, given my extremely tight work schedule. I'm the only faculty in a program with 150 majors, which I lead, and I am really involved in my field professionally and intellectually. I have also 2 kids, 7 chickens, and a new puppy. For every minute of my life I spend, I have come to require some evidence of immediate payback. Conversation and relationships are so languid you can't rush them. It's unclear whether or when anything concrete has been achieved. And then there's all the fluff of chit-chat. So my philosophy has always been that these things had to be cut. But what would shifting my priorities to relationships and conversation over to-do lists and lines on my CV mean for my work? What would it mean for the goals of the CAN? The second but related concept from the book I want to bring forward is broadening our notion of what counts as a deliverable or action item in the first place. Brown outlines a theory of the fractal and states that small is all. If we imagine our efforts as part of a large murmuration of others doing the same things, we may feel less ineffective, impotent in the face of the scale of the problems we see. What size and scale of actions does a can need to achieve in order to be successful at its stated goals? As a movement of starlings doing the things we are all describing in these talks, we are making crucial impacts in a lot of disparate places. This is consistent with Brown's notion of the fractal, in which the small is echoed in the large, also something that the philosophy of existentialism gets at too. Fractal impacts are nonlinear and iterative, but given the force of the many of us, how might a thoughtful coordination magnify the small of our efforts all the more? In conclusion, Brown discusses the importance of doing work that fuels us and knowing what to say no to. This lesson is so crucial for us and for our student activists. Saying no to things that feel more like should-dos than want-tos opens up the possibility for me to say yes to something that really compels me, and for others who are really fueled by that other work to take that on. This dispersion of labor, according to those who are most passionate about it, has so many benefits and is an essential principle of emergent strategy, in part because it is designed to sustain each of us. For me, participating in the CAN has been that kind of work. I am fueled by this work because it scales out my efforts, taps me into the energies and expertises of a wide range of people who all care about the same things I do, and creates all kinds of productive efficiencies, as Brown would put it. So I want to conclude by thanking the network for introducing me to work and people that fuel me, and I look forward to continuing saying yes to many of our collective strategies. Thank you.